I was slapped in the middle of my own cousin's wedding, right in front of hundreds of guests. They laughed. They filmed it. No one stood up for me. But then, I heard those footsteps. I looked up, my cheek still burning, tears still wet on my face, and he was standing there, in a suit that cost more than the wedding dress they'd been bragging about. No one knew that man was my husband. No one expected that he could shut down the entire event with a single phone call. My name is Maya, the librarian they all look down on. And today, they're going to learn what silence really means. Every family gathering follows the same routine. My relatives look at my simple clothes from discount stores, notice my 10-year-old car parked next to their luxury vehicles, and I can practically hear their thoughts. Poor Maya, they whisper. Still single, still struggling, still going nowhere. They speak to me with that pitiful tone that makes your skin crawl. The voice people use when they feel sorry for you, but don't actually want to help. What they don't know, what nobody knows, is that I've been living the most incredible life for 3 years now. Every morning, I wake up next to a man who could buy their entire neighborhood without checking his bank balance. My husband Nathan isn't just wealthy. He's the kind of rich that makes headlines, the kind of money that comes with private jets, multiple homes, and a security team that knows more about my daily routine than I do sometimes. But here's the thing nobody understands. I chose this quiet life. When Nathan and I got married in a small ceremony with just 2 witnesses, I made him promise me something that probably sounds crazy to most people. I asked him to let me stay invisible. I didn't want the designer clothes, the fancy car, or the mansion. I wanted to keep working at my little library, living in my small apartment, being just Maya, not Mrs. Reed, not the billionaire's wife. Just me. Nathan thought I was insane at first. He couldn't understand why someone would choose a modest life when they could have everything. But that's exactly why I fell in love with him. He respected my choice even when he didn't agree with it. Every day, he goes to his corner office in that glass tower downtown, making decisions that affect thousands of employees, while I stamp books and help elderly people find large print novels. And somehow, it works for us. When that cream-colored envelope arrived in my mailbox with Isabella's wedding invitation, I actually smiled for the first time in weeks. My cousin Isabella and I used to be close when we were kids before life and family politics drove us apart. She was getting married to some investment banker she'd been dating for 2 years, and despite everything, I was genuinely happy for her. I spent an entire Saturday shopping for the perfect dress, which, in my world, meant finding something under $50 that didn't look like it came from a thrift store. I settled on a navy blue dress with small flowers, simple, appropriate, and safe, nothing that would draw attention or give my family more ammunition to use against me. The week before the wedding, my phone rang. It was my Aunt Carol, Isabella's mother, and the unofficial family gossip coordinator. Maya, honey, she said in that fake sweet voice that immediately put me on guard. I just wanted to make sure you knew this is going to be a very elegant affair. Isabella's future in-laws are quite sophisticated people. I could read between the lines. She was telling me not to embarrass the family. I understand, and Carol, I replied, keeping my voice steady even though my stomach was churning. I'll dress appropriately. But appropriate in my world and appropriate in theirs were 2 very different things, and we both knew it. After I hung up, I stared at my reflection in the bathroom mirror, wondering if I should just make an excuse and skip the whole thing. But something inside me refused to hide. I had every right to be there, to celebrate with my family, even if they saw me as their charity case. The morning of the wedding, I put on my simple dress, my 1 pair of decent heels, and the pearl earrings my grandmother left me. Looking in the mirror, I knew I'd never compete with the other guests in their designer outfits and professional makeup, but I looked respectable. More importantly, I looked like myself. The wedding was everything you'd expect from someone trying to impress people they barely knew. Massive flower arrangements that probably cost more than I make in a month, a string quartet playing classical music, and guests who looked like they'd stepped out of a fashion magazine. I found my assigned seat at a table near the back, message received loud and clear about where I ranked in the family hierarchy. I was actually enjoying myself, watching Isabella float around in her $1,000 dress. genuinely happy that she looked so radiant on her special day. The ceremony had been beautiful, the food was incredible, and for once, my relatives seemed too distracted by the festivities to make pointed comments about my life choices. That's when disaster struck in the most ordinary way possible. I was trying to help clear some glasses from our table, wanting to be useful, when my elbow caught the edge of a wine glass. It happened in slow motion, the glass tipping, the deep red wine arcing through the air, and then the horrible splash as it hit Isabella's pristine white dress right across the bodice. The entire reception seemed to freeze. The string quartet kept playing, but every conversation stopped. Isabella looked down at the growing red stain on her dress, then up at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Pure volcanic rage. "You clumsy idiot," she screamed, her voice cutting through the music like a knife. "Do you have any idea how much this dress cost? How much this day means to me?" I started to apologize, the words tumbling out of my mouth in a panicked rush. "Isabella, I'm so sorry. It was an accident. Let me help clean it up. Maybe we can." But before I could finish, her hand flew across my face with a crack that echoed through the reception hall. The slap was so hard it knocked me sideways, and I tasted blood where my teeth cut into the inside of my cheek. The silence that followed was deafening. I could feel every pair of eyes in that room focused on me. I could hear the soft clicking of phone cameras capturing my humiliation for posterity. My family members looked mortified, not for me, but for themselves, for being associated with the woman who'd ruined the perfect wedding. I stood there, my hand pressed to my burning cheek, feeling smaller than I'd ever felt in my entire life. That's when I heard them, those familiar confident footsteps on the marble floor behind me. My heart stopped because I knew that walk better than my own. It was Nathan, but that was impossible. He was supposed to be in Singapore on business. He wasn't supposed to be anywhere near this wedding, wasn't supposed to be part of this disaster that was quickly becoming the worst moment of my life. I turned around slowly, afraid to hope, afraid to breathe, and there he was. Nathan stood in the doorway of the reception hall like something out of a movie, tall, imposing, dressed in a charcoal gray suit that probably cost more than most people's cars. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his jaw set in that hard line I only saw when someone had crossed a line they shouldn't have crossed. But what terrified me wasn't his presence, it was the look in his eyes. Nathan has these incredibly expressive brown eyes that usually hold so much warmth and humor. Right now, they looked like winter storms, cold and dangerous. He was scanning the room, taking in the scene, and when his gaze landed on my red cheek and the tears I was trying so hard not to shed, something shifted in his expression that made my blood run cold. This wasn't Nathan the husband, the man who made me coffee every morning and left little notes in my lunch bag. This was Nathan Reed, the billionaire CEO who'd built an empire from nothing and destroyed anyone who got in his way. This was the man whose business rivals called him ruthless, whose mere presence in a boardroom could make grown men sweat. Isabella was still ranting about her dress, still playing the victim, completely oblivious to the fact that the entire dynamic of the room had just shifted. My family members were starting to notice the stranger in the expensive suit, wondering who he was and why he was looking at their little drama with such intense interest. I wanted to run to him, to warn him, to leave before this got worse, but my feet felt frozen to the floor. Nathan began walking toward me with that measured pace that meant he was thinking, calculating, planning his next move. Every step brought him closer to my humiliation, closer to the secret we'd kept so carefully for 3 years. I looked up at him, my eyes pleading with him to just turn around and leave, to let me handle this disaster on my own. But Nathan had never been the kind of man to walk away from a fight, especially when someone he loved was involved. As he reached me, time seemed to slow down. I could see the exact moment when everyone in that reception hall realized that this wasn't just some random wedding crasher. This was someone important, someone who commanded attention without saying a word. And he was walking straight toward the family disappointment, toward me, with a look of pure determination that meant my carefully constructed double life was about to explode in the most spectacular way possible. Nathan didn't say a word as he stepped between me and Isabella, but his presence filled the space like electricity before a storm. I watched my cousin's face change from righteous anger to confusion as she found herself staring up at 6 feet of controlled fury in an expensive suit. The man she'd never seen before was looking at her like she was something unpleasant he'd found on his shoe. "Excuse me," Isabella stammered, trying to regain her authority, "but this is a private family matter. I don't know who you think you are," but her voice trailed off as Nathan's cold stare cut through her words like ice. I'd seen that look before in boardrooms, where million-dollar deals died with a single glance. It was the look of a man who owned everything in sight and knew it. Nathan reached back without looking and gently took my hand, his thumb brushing over my knuckles in that comforting way he always did when I was upset. That simple touch grounded me, reminded me that I wasn't alone in this nightmare. But to everyone watching, it was a clear statement of ownership, of protection, of someone claiming their territory. "Who am I?" Nathan repeated Isabella's question, his voice carrying that quiet authority that made CEOs sweat in corporate meetings. "That's an interesting question." He glanced around the room, taking in the phone still recording, the guests whispering behind their hands, my family members looking increasingly uncomfortable. "I'm wondering who you think you're hitting, my wife." The words dropped into the silence like stones into still water, sending ripples of shock through the entire reception. I heard my Aunt Carol gasp and watched my Uncle Mike's wine glass slip from his fingers. Isabella's face went white, then red, then white again as the implications hit her, my wife. Those 2 words changed everything. The silence that followed Nathan's declaration was deafening. I could practically hear the wheels turning in people's heads as they tried to process what they'd just heard. Maya, the family failure, was married to this man who looked like he'd stepped off the cover of Fortune magazine. It didn't compute with everything they thought they knew about my pathetic little life. Isabella was the first to recover, but her voice shook as she spoke. "Your wife? Maya doesn't have a husband. She's never even had a boyfriend that lasted more than a few months." She looked at me with desperate confusion, as if I might suddenly admit this was all some elaborate joke. "Maya, what is he talking about? Who is this man?" Before I could answer, Nathan pulled out his phone and showed her our wedding photo, the one where I'm laughing at something he whispered in my ear, both of us looking ridiculously happy despite the simple courthouse setting. "Maya Reed," he said simply. "My wife of 3 years." That's when my cousin's husband, the investment banker, went pale as recognition dawned. "Reed?" he whispered, pulling out his own phone and frantically typing. "Nathan Reed? Oh my God. Isabella, do you know who this is?" He turned his screen toward her, showing Nathan's photo from a recent Forbes article about tech billionaires under 40. The blood drained from Isabella's face as she read the headline. "Nathan Reed's company posts record profits. CEO worth estimated $3.2 billion. She looked from the phone to Nathan to me, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. The same woman who just called me a clumsy idiot was now staring at me like I'd grown a second head. "Impossible," she whispered. "Maya lives in some tiny apartment, works at a library, drives that horrible old car. She can't be married to." She gestured helplessly at Nathan, who was watching her mental breakdown with detached interest. "A billionaire?" Nathan finished for her. "Yes, she can, and she is. I know what you're thinking. How does a small-town librarian end up married to one of the richest men in the country? Trust me, I asked myself that question every day for the first year of our marriage. The story isn't some fairy tale romance, though it sometimes feels like one when I wake up next to Nathan and remember this is really my life. 3 years ago, I was working late at the downtown library, the old Carnegie building that most people forgot existed. It was almost 9 at night, and I was alone in the reference section trying to repair some water-damaged books from a leak in the roof. That's when Nathan walked in, looking completely out of place in his business suit among the dusty shelves and flickering fluorescent lights. He said he was looking for information about local history for a development project, but later he admitted he'd just seen the lights on and was curious about who worked so late in a library. We ended up talking until security kicked us out at closing time. He was different from what I expected, not arrogant or flashy, just genuinely interested in books, in history, in my thoughts about preserving old buildings in a changing city. Our first real date was at a 24-hour diner, where Nathan insisted on paying the $3 check and left a $50 tip that made our waitress cry. He told me later that night, as we sat in his car talking until sunrise, that he'd never met someone who looked at him like I did, like he was just Nathan, not Nathan Reed with his net worth attached to his name. When he proposed 6 months later, I said yes before he finished the question. But I also made him a promise that seemed crazy at the time, and probably seems even crazier now. I told him I wanted to keep being Maya, not become Mrs. Reed. I wanted my job, my apartment, my simple life. I needed to know he loved me for who I was, not who I could become with his money. The aftermath of Nathan's revelation was like watching dominoes fall in slow motion. Isabella went from angry bride to desperate social climber in the span of 30 seconds, her entire demeanor shifting as she realized she'd just publicly humiliated a billionaire's wife. The same hand that had slapped me was now reaching out tentatively, as if she could somehow undo what had just happened. "Maya, sweetie," she said, her voice taking on that fake honey tone I remembered from when we were kids and she wanted something. I had no idea. Why didn't you tell us? We're family. The word family came out strangled because we both knew how they'd treated their family for the past 3 years. Behind her, I could see my relatives having what looked like panic attacks. My Aunt Carol was frantically whispering to my Uncle Mike, probably calculating how much money they'd potentially offended. My cousin Jake was already pulling up Nathan's Wikipedia page, his eyes getting wider with every line he read. The same people who'd spent years making snide comments about my life choices were now staring at me like I was a completely different person. But the most surreal part was watching the other wedding guests, Isabella's fancy friends, the ones who'd barely acknowledged my existence an hour ago, suddenly very interested in introducing themselves. I watched phone cameras pivot from recording my humiliation to capturing what they now realized was a major social media moment. The revenge of the underestimated wife. Nathan's business partners, who I now realized had been scattered throughout the reception as wedding guests, began gravitating toward us like satellites finding their orbit. These were people whose names I'd heard in Nathan's work calls. Titans of industry who were now nodding respectfully at the woman they'd probably never imagined existed. The red wine stain on Isabella's dress seemed forgotten as she desperately tried to salvage the situation, her perfect wedding now overshadowed by the revelation that she'd just made the biggest social mistake of her life. Standing there in the middle of that chaos, with cameras flashing and whispers buzzing around me like angry bees, I had the strangest moment of clarity. For 3 years, I'd been living 2 separate lives, Maya the librarian and Maya the billionaire's wife, and I'd convinced myself that keeping them apart was protecting something precious. But watching my family scramble to rewrite their opinion of me based on my husband's bank account, I realized I'd been protecting the wrong thing. Nathan squeezed my hand and leaned down to whisper in my ear, "Whatever you want to do, we'll do. We can leave right now if you want." That's who Nathan was. Even in the middle of defending me, he was still giving me the choice, still respecting my need to control my own story. But for the first time in years, I didn't want to run away or hide from who I really was. I looked at Isabella, still babbling apologies and explanations, and felt something shift inside me. Not anger. I was too tired for anger. Not revenge. That felt too small. What I felt was a quiet kind of power. The realization that I didn't need their approval or their acceptance. I never had. I'd been so busy trying to prove I could be happy without their validation that I'd forgotten I already was happy. "Isabella," I said quietly, and somehow my voice carried over all the noise and confusion. The room fell silent again, everyone straining to hear what the billionaire's wife would say next. "I forgive you for hitting me. I know you were upset about your dress, and I really am sorry about the accident." I saw relief flood her face, but I wasn't finished. "But I don't forgive you for how you've treated me for years, how all of you have treated me." I looked around the room, making eye contact with family members who suddenly couldn't meet my gaze. I chose my life because it made me happy, not because I was settling for less. And the man who loves me enough to let me choose? He's worth more than all your opinions combined. What happened next wasn't the dramatic confrontation you might expect. Isabella's perfect wedding didn't end in screaming matches or thrown bouquets. Instead, it simply became irrelevant. The guests were no longer focused on the bride and groom cutting the cake or tossing the bouquet. They were focused on me, on Nathan, on the story that was already spreading through social media faster than wedding gossip. I watched Isabella realize that her special day had become about someone else entirely, and for a moment, I actually felt sorry for her. This was supposed to be her moment to shine, her chance to be the center of attention, and instead, she'd accidentally created a viral moment about family dynamics and hidden identities that had nothing to do with her marriage. The irony wasn't lost on me. By trying to humiliate me for ruining her dress, she'd given me something I'd never asked for: public vindication. My phone was buzzing with notifications as the story spread. Strangers on the internet defending the secret billionaire wife who'd been mistreated by her own family. It was surreal and overwhelming and completely unwanted. But what I realized, watching my family members awkwardly approach Nathan to introduce themselves, was that this wasn't really about them anymore. Their sudden interest in my life, their desperate attempts to repair relationships they'd never valued, none of it mattered. I'd spent so much energy trying to prove I didn't need their respect that I'd forgotten the most important truth. I already had everything I needed. Nathan's hand was steady in mine, anchoring me to what was real. The love between us hadn't changed because other people finally knew about it. My worth hadn't increased because they finally recognized it. I was the same Maya who'd walked into this reception, just with fewer illusions about what family really meant. As Nathan and I walked toward the exit, I felt lighter than I had in years, not because of the money or the status or the vindication, but because I'd finally stopped apologizing for who I was. The whispers followed us out, speculation about our relationship, our lifestyle, our future, but they felt distant and unimportant compared to Nathan's quiet presence beside me. In the parking lot, away from the cameras and the chaos, Nathan stopped and turned to face me. "Are you okay?" he asked, his CEO mask finally dropping to reveal the worried husband underneath. "I'm sorry I crashed your family event. I got back from Singapore early and wanted to surprise you, but when I saw what was happening," his jaw tightened again. "Nobody gets to hurt you. Nobody." I reached up and touched his face. This man who'd flown halfway around the world just to surprise me at a wedding, who'd protected me without hesitation, even though it meant revealing our secret. "I'm more than okay," I told him and meant it. "I think I'm finally awake." The drive home was quiet, both of us processing what had just happened. But as we pulled into our driveway, not the mansion Nathan had wanted to buy me, but the modest house we'd finally compromised on last year, I realized something important. This wasn't an ending at all. It was a beginning. For 3 years, I'd been living my life in 2 separate compartments, afraid that bringing them together would somehow diminish what Nathan and I had built. Instead, I'd learned that love doesn't need to be hidden to be protected. Authenticity doesn't require approval from people who never valued you in the first place. And sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is simply stop pretending to be smaller than you are, not because of money or status or who you're married to, but because you finally understand that you were never small to begin with. Your participation in the channel is very important. Please leave your opinion in the comments. I hope you enjoyed today's video. If you did, please leave a like to help me out, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on the next stories. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.